or severe heat felt by millions across the nation and across the globe on a daily basis, reaching the Capitol steps for this Congress to take action on the crisis, the environmental crisis that we are currently facing. Climate change is real, it is here, and the failure of this or any committee in Congress to take action will have real human costs. Still, I do not mean to suggest that there are not other factors that have contributed to these and other recent wildfires. We know that many factors are involved in the current wildfires and our wildfire risk, and that certainly includes encroachment of housing and development on forested wildlands, forest management decisions and resources, fire management, weather events like the historic lightning storm that struck California in August, the actions of people, the use of pyrotechnic devices, and the list unfortunately continues. I expect that after this fire year, we will look to learn from what has happened, have a robust policy discussion and debate, and do everything in our power to prevent such a drastic situation from happening in the future. Today, we're here to work together on the emergencies that face us right now. That is part of what I enjoy most about this subcommittee. We focus on how we can work together on behalf of our constituents. And this subcommittee is here to learn about what is happening since we last spoke in July about the 2020 wildfire season, what you expect may happen as it continues, and to explore how we can work with you to protect our communities from wildfires this season. I look forward to that discussion for our continued work together on the issues related to the U.S. Forest Service. I look forward to discussions about how we can continue our important work with you through the Farm Bill and annual funding cycle to ensure the health and resilience of our national forests, which are the economic drivers of small communities across the country. Thank you very much. In consultation with the ranking member and pursuant to Rule 11E, I want to make members of the subcommittee aware that other members of the full committee may join us today. I'd like to now welcome Ranking Member Mr. LaMalfa for his opening statement.
Well, thank you, Chair Spanberger. I really appreciate the effort it took to cause today's hearing today on this very, very important subject, as well as the participation of our subcommittee members and the full committee members that want to take part and weigh in. It's extremely important. Before I really begin, though, I think it's important we recognize the life and legacy of one of our former chairman of Ag Committee, Chairman Bob Smith. And right in the back there's a candle burning for him and a small picture, as well as his large portrait hangs in 1302. Bob's a family man, a team roper, a cattle rancher, banker, and contractor, and a legislator from Oregon. He loved this institution and understood that working across the aisle was the best way to succeed, as we all should know. Bob was a politician's politician, and many sought his quiet counsel. He appreciated the hard work of staff and understood the responsibility of his office. He was a credit to this committee and to the House of Representatives. He faithfully served in Oregon's 2nd District from 1983 to 1995, and again from 97 to 99. And between 97 and 99, Chairman Smith, that was his tenure as the chairman of the House Ag Committee. Oregonians can be proud of his service, and my prayers do go out to his family during this time. So thanks again, Chair Spanberger. As we know, as you mentioned, this year western states have experienced yet another catastrophic fire season with 7 million acres burned. In California, 3.6 million acres burned so far. I'm afraid future fire seasons will only get worse unless we dramatically improve the management and health of our national forest system. In fact, the Forest Service has identified nearly 50% of the 193 million acres of the national forest system is currently at high risk of wildfire or likely to be impacted by insect and disease outbreaks. At current pace, it will take the Forest Service nearly 30 years to treat these acres. Our national forests are facing an epidemic of declining health, which is in direct correlation to disastrous policies that have led to a dramatic decrease in management, even on the portions of the national forests outside of roadless and wilderness areas. In recent years, Congress has addressed fire borrowing with a fire funding fix and provided new authorities in an attempt to streamline forest management. While there's not a single policy solution to solving wildfires, it is clear that our piecemeal approach is not nearly enough. Nearly 2 years ago, California experienced its most deadly wildfire on record when the Camp Fire in the Paradise, Magalia area took 85 lives and destroyed the town of Paradise as well as outlying areas of Magalia, Yankee Hill, and Concal. At that time, Congress should have acted. The House and Senate Ag Committees were conferencing the 2018 Farm Bill, and we had the opportunity to adapt a number of bipartisan House provisions that would have helped prevent further loss of life and property from wildfires. These bipartisan House provisions were created with input from U.S. Forest Service under both the Obama and Trump administrations. However, despite good faith efforts by the Republican Farm Bill conferees, the Senate Democrats refused to even discuss these critical reforms. Healthy forests require active management in the form of mechanical thinning, prescribed fires, and other activities to ensure they do not become overgrown tinderboxes as we see now. However, under the status quo, addressing at-risk acres takes years and years, and these delays harm the very acres we're trying to protect. For instance, the 2018 Music Fuels Reduction Act project in the Sierra National Forest had a proposed treatment area of 12,000 acres to respond to tree mortality and remove fuels along roads. To my knowledge, there was no litigation that delayed the project, yet analysis took nearly 2 years to the day to complete. Unfortunately, these easily identified 5 fire-prone acres were consumed in the creek fire before the restoration work could even begin. We can address these issues with common sense approaches that benefit both our forests and our rural communities. There are many ideas we can bring to the table and act on immediately. One example is H.R. 7978, the Emergency Wildfire and Public Safety Act. I am proud to have worked with my colleague, Representative Panetta, to introduce this bill to help protect the West from these catastrophic wildfires and implement common sense forest management reforms that will help prevent these fires in the future. While this is a good start, more work will be needed. Congress could consider any number of individual authorities from bipartisan legislation such as categorical exclusions for salvage to address landscape scale mortality events caused by wildfire, insect infestation, and disease, and drought. I encourage my colleagues to take action on these ideas and others without delay. We are indeed fortunate to have Mr. John Phipps from the Forest Service. He is the Deputy Chief of State and Private Forestry testifying for us today. Appreciate that. We hope to hear about his experience with wildfire issues, what tools the U.S. Forest Service has at its disposal, and what tools are needed further to prevent and suppress wildfires. So before I yield back, I would like to take a moment again to thank all of our Forest Service firefighters and the other first responders that are currently at risk, and those that already, that was mentioned, have given their lives to protect our forests, homes, and communities. We are indeed forever grateful for their service, and I hope that today's hearing will lead us to comprehensive solutions and make their jobs easier in the future. Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll yield back to you.
The chair would request that other members submit their opening statements for the record, so witnesses may begin their testimony and to ensure that there is ample time for questions. I would like to welcome our witness. Thank you for being here today. Mr. Phipps began his role as Deputy Chief of State and Private Forestry at USDA's Forest Service in 2019. He started his career with the Forest Service in 1976 and has since held a variety of roles within the agency. Prior to his current position, Mr. Phipps served as the station director for the Rocky Mountain Research Station from 2015 to 2019. We will now proceed to hearing your testimony. You will have 5 minutes. When 1 minute is left, the light will turn yellow, signaling the time is close to expiring, and you should be able to see a clock ticking down on one of these boxes on the screen before you. So, Mr. Phipps, please begin whenever you are ready.
Good afternoon, everyone. Chair Spanberger, Ranking Member, and members of the committee, I am proud to be representing the Forest Service today as a career professional forester with decades of experience dedicated to our mission of stewarding America's forests and grasslands for current and future generations. I have experience as a firefighter, land manager, research leader, and senior executive currently leading the agency's state and private forestry programs, including fire and aviation management. My testimony will outline the current status of Forest Service response to wildfires, the efforts that we have ongoing to take care of our employees and communities before, during, and after fires occur, Our nation is enduring a devastating wildfire year, one that has cut destructive swaths through states like California, Oregon, Washington, Colorado, and Arizona, and made more difficult by the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. As of September 19th, there have been almost 43,000 fires that have burned more than 7.2 million acres across all jurisdictions. In addition to homes and property damage, these fires have taken lives throughout the country. We are mourning the tragic loss of Charlie Morton, Big Bear hotshot squad boss, who died last Thursday in California while fighting the El Dorado fire on the San Bernardino National Forest. Charlie's memorial service is tomorrow in San Bernardino. It's an understatement to say that this is an unprecedented year. Numerous large fires since mid-August have been in and around very large communities and developed areas across California and the Pacific Northwest. Smoke impacts have been horrendous and widespread across western United States. One of the most notable challenges this year is the number of fires taking place at the same time, which has stretched us thin. Since August 18th through today, the demand for fire resources has exceeded supply across the system. As with any fire year, it takes all partners, federal, state, and local government, tribal, contractors, and volunteers to respond. We all work together to ensure we are making the best use of our resources to protect the public and our firefighters. As of September 19th, over 32,700 interagency firefighters were supporting wildfire operations across the country, primarily in California, Oregon, and Washington. This is a record for most firefighters ever deployed. To bolster our capabilities, we requested assistance from the active military as well as our international partners. Additionally, states have requested assistance from their National Guards. Preventing the spread of COVID among our first responders and communities is an important addition to our focus on safety this year. The Forest Service has been successful with implementing our COVID prevention and mitigation measures like spread out fire camps, social distancing, and mask wearing. I'd like to conclude by recognizing the efforts of this committee that took to establish the Congressional Fire Funding Fix. As a result, the Forest Service no longer must delay priority work that results from transfers of funding from other Forest Service programs to pay for ongoing fire operations. I welcome any questions you may have.
Thank you so much, Deputy Chief Phipps. Thank you again for being here, and thank you for being patient with us working around a voting schedule. Thank you for your important testimony. At this time, members will be recognized for questions in order of seniority, alternating between majority and minority members. You will be recognized for 5 minutes each. In order to allow us to get as many questions as possible, please keep your microphones muted until you are recognized in order to minimize background noise. When 1 minute is left, the light will turn yellow, signaling time is close to expiring. I will begin by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. And I wanted to follow up on, you said a couple noteworthy things, well, many noteworthy things, but specific to what I wanted to follow up on, you talked about the record number of firefighters who are currently deployed fighting fires throughout the West. You talked about the social distancing and the impact that COVID-19 is having on the work that you all are doing. And you talked about the funding needs. So I'd like to follow up on this question of resources. Of course, Congress appropriated $1 billion for wildfire suppression this year. And in addition to this, as you mentioned, another $1.9 billion is available through the wildfire funding fix. Given the current conditions, do you anticipate the need to utilize this new budget authority? To what full extent? And can you provide the subcommittee with an update as to any transfers the Department of Interior has made for wildfire suppression this year?
Thank you for the question. I'll start with the easiest one first. Department of Interior requested $47 million transfer, which we made, and earlier we had transferred to them $2 million as normal cost sharing between the departments. Relative to where we are in our fire suppression funding, we're still within our appropriated amount for that, and we don't anticipate going over it. And the reason for that is that this particular fire year, all the fires seem to happen at once later in the summer. And the interagency community just didn't even have the capability to spend at the rate that it would have to have taken. Normally, the fires are spread out across the whole year, and those types of years are when we're more likely to go over the budget and have to dip into the reserve account.
Okay. And you mentioned interagency, and so I'm curious. I have concerns, and I would love your opinion about what the United States has or doesn't have currently in terms of a federal strategy to reduce the risk of destructive wildfires overall. And specifically, in your opinion, could federal planning, coordination, and development of strategies for community resilience, land use planning, specifically for development along the wildland urban interface, help reduce the risks posed by destructive wildfires? And what are some of the major risks posed by development along the WUI? And are there precautions that could be taken to mitigate these risks when building?
Thank you. The wildland fire system, our wildland fire problem is complex. You've mentioned several of the factors. It's development in wild areas, it's climate factors, forest management factors for sure. And what we're seeing on the landscape now is we used to call them mega fires, but they're even larger than that. They're landscape scale fires that can go 250,000 plus. We have one in California that's 800,000 acres, and we currently operate at a lesser scale than that. The agency doesn't have a capacity currently, but we could. We probably need to be scaling up 2 to 3 times more at least. The other problem we have is that we tend to think about these fires as they're all occurring and as a result of how we manage federal forest. That's true in part, but it's really an all lands problem that we, particularly in California, we see fires originating on private land and marching up into the forest and vice versa. And so we're going to have to start thinking more comprehensively, I think, across ownerships if we want to see a different picture. And I would assure you our scientists suggest that these western landscapes have an incredible capability to absorb fire and keep on going. We're going to see much more of the same. And to that, I don't think that's a desirable future, and it's pretty alarming. And as the ranking member suggested, we need to come together and look at this differently. It's on a scale that's hard for people to imagine. Just one additional fact, again in California, pre-settlement, on average, the average forest had 64 trees per acre. Currently, the average forest in California has 320. That's 80% more density. And how did that happen? It happened because we've been trying to, for over 110 years, to put out every fire we can, and we've been really successful at that. But it's creating a situation where all across all jurisdictions, we attempt to put out all those fires. And as a result, we're selecting away the good fire, and the 2% that normally gets away, the catastrophic fire. When that happens under the right conditions, there's no stopping it, basically. We're there to help people get out of the way, There's just tragic loss of life, and these fires burn at high severity, and it's just really a bad trajectory that we're on, and it's going to take really a paradigm shift in thinking. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deputy Chief, for your testimony. And we have gone a little bit over with my questions, but I want to confirm, you gave the number 64 trees per acre before settlement. Now it's up to 320. Just to ensure that I've understood and the rest of the committee is following along, that's because natural fires that were coming through would have processed and would have taken out trees over time so that we were at that natural rate of 64. Is that what you're stating? Okay.
That's exactly right, Chair Spanberger. In a way, the way these forests evolved with fire, and fire did the work.
Interesting. Okay.
Routinely.
Those numbers are really, really interesting to think about in that way. I'm going to continue on, and I will now recognize Ranking Member Congressman LaMalfa for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you again. Thank you again, Deputy Chief Phipps, as well. I just want to touch on a statement you made there, too, and I wholeheartedly agree on the idea that the density and population in our forest is much more than what is sustainable, especially if you're talking about drought periods as we go in and out of in the West. You mentioned that private lands that are adjacent, I don't see them as being the initial cause of very many fires unless there happens to be some kind of an accident on that, because private lands, they're either grazed or managed, they're logged and forested and all those kinds of measures. So unless they're unable to get the permits to do what they would like to do, which is sometimes a regulatory challenge that private lands would have. So I'd be hesitant to say that private lands are igniting federal lands very often. Indeed, it's the federal lands that are the scary neighbor to private lands over in western Tehama County. One family, it has, I think, approximately 70,000 acres, has lost about 50,000 of their timberland due to fires occurring on a nearby Forest Service property. I think the 800,000 acre one you're speaking of. So let's talk a little bit about one of the issues with prevention. That what we're seeing, you can see from space, from satellite, the amount of smoke plume coming up from the western states. And we see that plume going across the country, and we've even felt it here in Washington, D.C. to an effect on the skies here, as well as massive levels of air quality. There's way more than the unhealthy mark more locally there. And I understand it's even hitting Europe in the jet stream. So what hasn't happened is preventative measures, including prescribed fire. Prescribed fire meaning fires that we intentionally set at a time of year when you can control them. And we lost out this year on the chance, and in other years, to have more prescribed fire to burn when we dictate, at a level we dictate, and instead that was shut down. And some of it was because they pointed to air quality issues. So I guess my contrast with that would be, what kind of air quality issue are we having versus a prescribed fire at a given amount of acres that gives you a buffer zone, gives you a fire break? What is it we need to do more of? Is it prescribed fire, or to allow them to burn the way we're burning now?
Well, I think it depends on what we want. If we want to maintain forest, we need to start we need to safely return fire to the landscape. The way we're doing it now, it's all well intended. It's just not a rapid enough pace or at the right scale. And there's a number of papers in the science literature that would indicate that prescribed fire smoke, particularly given it would be more on our terms, is much more benign than fire at the worst time of the year in the summer, heat, and every total consumption of forest. This event this year was just horrendous. It was the particulate PM.25, that's maybe too technical, but it was like record levels and the worst air quality in the world along the West Coast.
Horrific, yes. Let me touch on another point here in my allotted time. Talking about the loss of life, loss of lands, loss of livestock, and we have one particularly tragic story on the livestock side, right near my home in Butte County. And I would like, with the permission of the chair, to submit this for the record from Mr. Dave Daly. He entitles it, "I Cry for the Mountains and for the Legacy Lost on what's known as the Bear Fire." And so it breaks your heart to read this. And what I would like to ask upon the heels of this, they're still out trying to recover cattle from their area. You know, many generations of family legacy that's gone there. You must read that. But the Forest Service make an accommodation for ranchers that still have cattle that are looking for them by extending the grazing permit for grazing off dates if necessary. And will they work with ranchers on replacement grazing for those who have lost their allotments due to wildfire? These are, I think, a couple small things we could do for these folks with their horrendous losses. Can we accommodate those? Mic up, please.
I believe we can. There's a lot of allotment management plans. It's complicated, and our grazing process may be a little bit constraining, but we would certainly have that interest to try to mitigate their loss.
Okay, we would try. Do you think this is an effort we can really push hard for? Because these losses are very real, and when they've lost, you know, in a given forest unit, tens of thousands of acres as well as millions across the West, they need a replacement for this, and the losses are already devastating. We need a really concerted effort to do that. Can you pledge that we will push for that here in upcoming weeks?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I'm over my time, but so there's the communication sometimes is a little slow too when there might be a fire impending that these folks need to know about and hear about when they should be clearing their cattle out of a given area. So let's see if we can improve on that as well. So, Madam Chair, I'll yield back. Thank you.
The chair now recognizes Congressman O'Halloran for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for this meeting and ranking member. I would like to thank, I already did that. Fire plays an important role in our environment. My district has all or parts of 6 national forests and the Grand Canyon. But if not properly managed and planned for, it causes massive devastation, as we have seen in recent weeks. And in addition to that, the loss of life is increasing time and time again. And I know that's not just the Forest Service, it's how we put our communities together and everything else, but the that urban interface area is critically important when you see whole communities be devastated like they have, and the effect it has on human life, families, the impact on the natural resources, and in Arizona, a lot of our watershed. This fire year, Arizona has seen over 700,000 acres burn. That's more than the last 2 years combined. Working my time here is in Congress. I've seen we've had expanded Forest Service authorizations to better manage and plan for fire. Mr. Phelps, I have a few questions about those authorizations and look forward to your responses today or at a later date if you cannot answer today. First question is, Congress implemented the fire funding fix during the 115th Congress to move rapidly fund suppression efforts without the need to use non-fire funding. I would like to know how well this has worked and has the ensuing budgetary stability resulted in increased efforts related to fire prevention, Particularly, has there been additional work done by the department in the form of treatment and controlled burns, which you mentioned a little bit ago? Are wildland-urban interfaces being prioritized?
Thank you for the question. The fire funding fix is, I think it's an understatement to say it's one of the best things that we received. It really helped stabilize the Forest Service, and that was just a lot of chaos every year that we had to transfer. So thank you so much for that. As far as, and that's allowing us to better plan for a lot of things, including focusing our treatments and implementing them. And I think that's in large part because of the fire funding fix. One of the things that happened prior to the fix being put in place was that pretty much systematically over quite some time, say 15 years, the capacity to do that kind of work was reduced because all the money was also in the budget going towards fire suppression. You know, we were at one time 15% of the agency was fire funding related. Now it's around 55%. And now, just at the right time where we need to ramp up and scale up to these large landscape scales in our planning, we are lacking the capacity. So I think that can be remedied, but it is a definite thing that we're looking forward to as now we're trying to get now that we have the fire funding fix, we need to ramp up capacity to do the work.
Thank you. How have stewardship contracts and projects such as Forestry in my district improved forest resiliency? How is the USDA supporting these large-scale projects? And on the Forestry project, we've been trying for any number of years to get it up and working at a larger scale. So I'd like to hear your
Yeah, the stewardship contracting and projects is a wonderful gift for us because, like I'd mentioned earlier, a lot of these, the treatments on the landscape have to be all lands, and it allows us to pursue that.
Deputy, I only have a couple of seconds. I guess the core of my question is, why is it taking so long to get these projects up and going and sustained?
Well, it's complex for us. A lot of the environmental work, we've been trying to streamline, we've been trying to do things to make life easier for the planners, but between capacity problems and environmental review problems, we haven't implemented as fast as we'd like, and we'd look forward to continuing to work with the committee to help streamline those.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Deputy. I just want to say the district has almost 700,000 acres already NEPA approved. They're all within that stewardship area, and I just can't understand why we haven't gotten to them. Thank you.
The chair now recognizes Congresswoman Pingree from Maine, seeing no minority members currently present. Congresswoman Pingree, we cannot hear you. Congresswoman Pingree, we cannot hear you. As we continue to work out the technical issues for Congresswoman Pingree, the chair now recognizes Congressman Cox from California for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you so much, Chairwoman Spanberger. And just before I ask my question, Mr. Phipps, you were saying earlier that the recommended density is what, 64 trees, and it's 320 or something like that per acre?
Yes, that's correct.
Oh, okay. So I don't know if it's an arithmetic type thing, but you were saying that was 80% over capacity, but it's really 500%, isn't it?
Yeah, that's
So it's 5 times, not
right.
not just 80%.
That's correct.
Right. Oh, okay, great. Yeah, a bit of a difference there. But certainly in a year that's seen record heat waves and the coronavirus pandemic, hazardous smoke from wildfires across the West are presenting the latest danger for the essential men and women who pick America's fruit and vegetable crops. And health advisories have recommended that individuals remain indoors to abate health impacts. Farm workers simply don't have that option while working in poor air quality conditions that can damage their lungs. You certainly can't pick a peach by Zoom. And despite efforts to distribute N95 masks to farm workers, the unfortunate reality is that many still do not have access to these masks, and we, as members of Congress, must remain vigilant in ensuring that all of our frontline workers, especially those ensuring food remains on America's tables, are protected. And so I certainly support the Forest Service's decision to protect public health with the temporary forest closures in California. And I was also glad that this wasn't just a national decision, but one that was made with the forest supervisors within the region. And a wildfire's path, as you very well know, it's not limited to just the structures or the trees that are burned. And even once a wildfire has been contained, communities remain at risk for a variety of post-wildfire impacts, such as harmful air quality, mudslides, soil erosion, poor water quality, and all these linger well after the flames are put out. Debris runoff from destructive wildfires can enter our watersheds and have negative water quality impacts. Subsequent rains can wash toxic runoff, ash, and heavy debris into our watersheds, harming streams, rivers, municipal water systems. And I know that the agency has several programs to help this, including BEAR and new programs from the 2018 Farm Bill, and that the department itself has even more beyond this one agency. But the agency has not requested a funding increase for the Water Source Protection Program authorized by the 2018 Farm Bill. And my worry, and we're getting to the question, is that the agency will already have to stretch their budget in order to maintain these vital programs. And so the question, why hasn't the agency asked for funding increases for these programs? And what can be done to mitigate these negative water quality impacts on wildfires? What steps is the Forest Service taking to address this during both the wildfire response and the recovery phases?
Thank you for the question. You're correct in that the BEAR process, we've been doing that for 15 years at least, maybe 2 decades. And we have our hydrologists, fish scientists, you name it, go out and do an assessment and then plan for emergency application of seed and maybe creating dikes and just removing wood. And we currently, across the country, there's 7 million acres that have burned, and we have teams doing the assessment. They haven't completed it yet. We think that we have enough funding because it's paid out of suppression to take care of it. And it is going to be there's probably going to be a capacity problem, and we're going to have to prioritize and make sure that we implement the projects that have the most meaningful effect. And it's probably going to go over, the effort is aimed at making sure we get that done before the winter rains come. And there may be some need to go on into the following year.
Well, no, thanks very much. And the meat of the question is, are funding increases for these programs warranted and something that the agency needs?
Could you repeat that?
The funding increases we're asking is that the department hasn't yet requested a funding increase for the water source protection programs. Is this something that that the budget is okay with? Do you need additional investments in capital, or what?
Well, we have the adequate funding for BEAR, but I'm not familiar with that program that you just mentioned, but I'd be happy to get back with you.
Great, and thanks so much.
Thank
We'll
you.
yield.
It's the chair's understanding that minority members are on their way, but in their current absence, I will continue recognizing Congresswoman Pingree from Maine, if we can connect this time.
Can you hear me this time? We're having some WebEx issues in the room that they're still trying to work on, so.
It appears there are ongoing technical issues here local to us, Congresswoman Pingree, so we will come back to you. The chair now recognizes Congresswoman Schreier, who's with the continued technical difficulty, the chair now recognizes Mr. Costa for 5 minutes.
I thank the chairperson if you give me a moment before the clock starts until I can pull up my memo on the effort. So, well, let me start on a question that is based upon a congressional briefing that a bipartisan California congressional briefing that Congressman Lamoff and I and others participated in last week with the head of CAL FIRE, Tom Porter, and the head of OES from California. And he cited Mr. Phipps, that based upon the incredible amount of wildfires we've had in California, as well as in Oregon and Washington and other western states, that he thought it was necessary that we revisit the National Management Forest Plan in terms of resources, in terms of forest management. You know, we've tried to work on that over the last 18 months with some changes that have been made. Clearly, given the fact that the intensity and the impacts, it seems to me, in California's instance, over 60% of the fires have been on Forest Service land, less than 10% on state forest land, and then a lot of private land, of course. Could you care to comment, Mr. Phipps?
Yes, the interagency community has something called the Cohesive Wildland Fire Strategy, and that was done, maybe 7-8 years ago. It has some good intentions. The federal agencies had something called the Fire Plan. We call it Fire Plan 1.0, and currently we're working on Fire Plan 2.0 that would...
Okay, for a lot of folks, those are just numbers, so
Yeah.
what do they mean?
Well, it's an update to the nation's interagency fire plan, specifying how much we should be putting into hazardous fuels treatment, what kind of resources do we need, what do we need in communities, that kind of thing.
Well, what do you think, under lessons that have been learned in the last 6 months, are the changes you're looking at?
Well, I think the big lesson is we need to think big. We have to have, if we're going to try to get a managed landscape that is resilient to fire, we need to do much more than we're doing now, and that has to be with participation of communities, state lands, federal lands, and private lands.
And in that effort, the resources, I mean, you know, the last couple of years, a lot of the money that we've had for forest management has been referred over to putting fires out, and we don't. Do you have an assessment of how much appropriation really needs to be set aside to manage U.S. Forest Service lands? Have you made that assessment?
Real rough, we think 2 to 3 times more in the land management area and fuels management.
The and last year, how much was that?
We had probably about a billion total.
So you're saying somewhere between 2 and 3
Yes,
over what period of time?
annually.
Annually?
It took us 110 years to get here. It's going to take at least 10 years to get to a more desirable future, because the extent of the fuels on the landscape, it's almost everywhere you look. It's
On the creek fire that I've been exposed to, went out a week ago, going to probably go back out on Saturday to survey the update on that, one of the devastating fires. Chief Dave Schloss, 30-year veteran from San Diego area, but he's up there trying to deal with this, indicated to me that frankly, we just don't, we're stretched too thin. And in this case, this is an area that is predominantly forest land that you've given jurisdiction to CAL FIRE to manage this particular fire here. That seems unusual, but I think we've got 14,000 firefighters out there. We got the National Guard just in California alone, and we're short.
Yeah, we had, this year was an extraordinary year, and the system was not designed. It broke the system to try to respond to all that amount of fire all at the same time. And it's likely the case that we need to maintain the fire suppression capability while we're working to manage the landscape better over at least a 10-year period.
All right. Madam Chair, my time's expired, but I finally found my memo in terms of the questions that I want to direct, so I can either do that afterwards, or if you allow a second round for questioning, I'll be happy to stay here and take that opportunity.
Thank you for being so responsive when we needed you to take your turn. We will be happy to put you back on the list, Mr. Costa.
Okay, thank you.
The chair now recognizes Mr. LaMalfa for 5 minutes.
Thank you again, Madam Chair. It's unfortunate that we have currently votes on the floor on a whole list of amendments and a bill, and as well as other concurring or concurrent committees happening on. We would have more of our members here, but that said, let me pick back up on, we were talking about grazing when I left off, and you can talk to any rancher, anybody that works the land in an area that has a valley and forest interface or much more forested areas. And they'll tell you that grazing is a very important tool, not only to keep their livestock going, but it actually helps with the fire. It helps suppress fire. We talked about this. And then you can take anecdotally photographic evidence where a grazed field, you have a fire burns right up to the fence line, and it stops. So there's been reluctance to have grazing be a more widespread use. It's not anything new under the sun, and they act like it is. Like, oh, let's have a pilot program on grazing. What's there to prove? We know it works. It reduces the fine fuels down there. And again, we don't talk about grazing everything off, but there's certainly strategic zones where this is useful for keeping the loads down, fuel loads, and as well as the type of fire break zones that would be helpful for firefighters. And when a fire does occur, they could have an area where they can manage. So has the Forest Service, is it really ready to, because we see what's known as AUMs, animal unit months, the amount of feed that cattle and others can use during a given time, those numbers are decreasing of AUMs being put out for grazing purposes, for cattle, sheep, even goats. We have goat herds that are going out, helping out in small zones. So why are we seeing a downward trend in this when this is a very effective tool? We talked a minute ago about fire, prescribed fire, and you have the unpopular component of smoke coming from that, air quality issues. But as you mentioned there, the air quality is going to be a lot different under a controlled fire than the masses we have here. But if you want to get away from that, why isn't grazing used as a much broader tool that benefits several win-win categories here?
Thank you for that question. I think, yes, there's areas where grazing can be very helpful. As I'd mentioned earlier, a lot of the nation's western forests have an incredible density. It really wouldn't lend itself to grazing. In the aftermath of fires, of course, that changes and salvage. So I think that range managers are always looking for opportunities to increase animal unit months.
Do range managers consult with livestock owners on what they think that density is? Because they turn them loose in some pretty dense stuff that you might not have every thicket be grazable, but there's areas in between.
Yes,
is that a strong consult with those that own the livestock?
Yes, routinely, I would say, in my experience, I actually administered grazing permits in Idaho. I believe that we're always attending to relationships with ranchers and asking them what they think about things and how can we better manage the grazing resource together.
Can we get a greater commitment to this as an effective tool? There's those that don't want to cut trees. There's those that don't want to have prescribed burns. This seems like a win-win to me. Can we get a bigger push for this?
Yes, the Forest Service will look into this and get back to you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Costa was alluding to and you responded, we're talking about readiness. Of course, an unprecedented amount of lightning strikes happened in one time in California and turned out a lot of fires from that. But we run into the problems with the Viper contracts. You know what those are, that contract with people ahead of time. And the system seems like broken in such that if you don't do it exactly the perfect way on timing or what have you, they kick you out and you can't talk to them for 3 years. Mr. McNeil in my district has talked about how he was working with one person in one office in Sacramento, as he had been for many years. He's a contractor that helps service heavy equipment that would be out on the fire line. Then he finds out he gets rejected, and they told after the fact, oh, you have to talk to this other office to get your contract going. Well, how's he supposed to know that, especially since he has a track record of working with the one? So they work with the other office, and they submit the thing by FedEx and timely, and they get rejected on that. So now we have a person who's been an ace mechanic for many years, helping with these contracted pieces of equipment out there, helping on the fire lines, being kicked out until they decide later, oh, we better reinstate him. So that, as well as many other stories you could talk about with the Viper system, the emails not being returned, the website being not timely, folks not processing these. If we want to have a state of readiness, there's so much private equipment. I drove past some in Siskiyou County today. There's still about 20 water tender trucks sitting along the freeway there that have not been contracted because of a breakdown in the ability to process them. So what can we see an improvement in that area for, in this case, this mechanic, Mr. McNeil and others just trying to be part of a solution, whereas, we're overwhelmed with Forest Service and other agencies, the personnel and equipment they have.
Yes, thank you for that. We acknowledged that we had problems in California, not with the Viper system per se, but how it was staffed. There was technical and administrative issues, and we brought in more people. And I understand that the contracting issues have pretty much subsided.
Okay, because there needs to be a makeup opportunity for that. If it's a 3-year term, then that needs to be waived so that people can get signed up back into the system, because we're still not by any means out of the fire woods yet, so to speak, in the north and in the south, probably year-round. So I'll yield back. I see Mr. Balderson has come into the room, and I'd like to welcome him as a newer member of the committee and as a member of the subcommittee as well. So good to see you here. So thank you, Madam Chair. I'll yield back.
The chair now recognizes Congresswoman Pingree for 5 minutes. Deputy Chief Phipps, thank you for bearing with us through these technical challenges. We truly appreciate it. While we're working out the technical challenges and continuing to do so,
Trying to get on this other thing with them.
the chair now recognizes
Okay.
Congressman Costa for 5 minutes.
I thank the chairperson again for allowing me a second round of the questioning. I wanted to follow up on some of the comments that were made by my colleague from California as it relates to some of the health issues. But as you know, Deputy Chief, these fires are not only major issues for western states, but for our constituents, even if you're not directly in the fire, the smoke has been like a nuclear winter. I mean, where when you have been able to see the sun, it's been orange, and ash coming from 30, 40 miles away. And they obviously impact air quality as well as water quality in an area that is a closed-in basin, the San Joaquin Valley, that already is a non-attainment area. I know the Forest Service and meteorologists are working with federal and state leaders to improve the use of satellites modeling to predict things like smoke movement. These smoke impacts in terms of smoke maps are critical for public health efforts. Have you folks looked at doing more in that area in research so that you can provide efforts? We have a lot of people who are asthmatic, a lot of people who have, other health issues, pre-existing conditions, and that would be, and of course we've got the pandemic, COVID-19.
Yeah, thank you for that question. We're very concerned about that because we know that smoke does have quite an impact on the American public. This last event, friends out on the West Coast, even quite some distance from the fire, just like you said, had less than a quarter of a mile visibility.
No, we had 3 Category 1 fires, and
it's just terrible, and I'm sure
smaller
that
fires.
people had to stay inside, and even I had heard that people that stayed inside were coughing, and that was quite an impact. The best option for us, I believe, is to manage the landscapes to prevent that, but until we do, the best thing we can do is give notification in advance. We have a lot of modeling and efforts that we've been working with NOAA and others on these different models to try to give as much notice as we can so people that are particularly sensitive to smoke can get out of harm's way.
Well, I want to make a suggestion to the chairperson and the subcommittee and working with the full committee. The impacts of this throughout the country, but certainly in the West, are such that I would hope that the subcommittee would, and Congressmember Panetta's had his own fire in his constituency, so it's important that we try to, I think, focus on this not only the end of this year, but next year, in terms of providing the support necessary for the U.S. Forest Service. And I know both Congresswoman Spangler and Congressmember Panetta are concerned, as well as Congressman LaMaffa. But I think, Deputy Chief, you ought to come back with recommendations to us as we look at the two, what would you call them, Plan 1 and Plan 2, would you call them? What was the technical term?
Yeah, updated fire plan, yep.
Yeah, the updated fire plan, and I think this ought to be the subject, Congressman Panetta, because I know of your concern as we try to reassess next year with the budget, with the appropriations process. You say while you were gone, Congressman Panetta, they estimated that if we're really to try to manage this, it's somewhere between $2 to $3 billion to do the forest management service, and that's nowhere near where we've provided budget for management of the forest, right?
That's correct.
So let me close on this note. I gave a speech last week about this after Chief David Schloss took me through the Creek Fire, and I learned a lot. And I'm going to go back, I think, Saturday. One, we've got to better manage our forests from every element that's contained therein. And that's from thinning to clearing brush to dealing with both the forest and the chaparral country that's different in different regions of the country and different regions of California. Number two, we've got to re-examine land use policy. We've got hundreds and thousands of people living where they did not live before 30 years ago. And three, climate change is a part of this, and we're going to have to focus on all of the above. The climate change is a little longer term. The other issues are more immediate. But I think we have to have a strategy, Congressman Panetta, that employs all of the above, both with long-term efforts as well as the short-term efforts that we can apply in the next Congress. And so there will be some other points, questions I want to raise, and I'll submit them to the subcommittee afterwards. And I thank you for giving me this second round.
Thank you, Jim. I appreciate that. The gentleman's time has expired. Now yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Balderson.
Thank you, Chairman. You changed all names back there, so thank you. Thank you for being here today, Mr. Phipson. In your role as the Deputy Chief for State and Private Forestry within USDA, I look forward to your comments, and I've missed most of them, obviously, but thank you. In your testimony, you described the unprecedented challenges millions of Americans have faced this year. You say that as of last week, over 7 million acres of land have burned. This has devastating impacts to those who have lost their loved ones, their homes, and their livelihoods. These fires have even impacted the state of Ohio through changes to the air quality and stretched federal resources in the middle of a pandemic. Of the land that's burned this year, what's the breakdown of federal versus non-federal land?
Well, I don't have the exact figures, but roughly half of it, maybe a little bit more, was on federal lands.
Okay, thank you. In your testimony also, you talk about the steps being taken by the White House to reduce the risk of wildfire. Specifically, I'm referring to the President Trump's Executive Order 13855. I support these types of actions, but I also believe Congress should be more active. What tools can we in Congress provide to the Forest Service that would enable you to better prevent these fires?
Well, I think it's not only the authorities. I think we have a lot of them. And right now, it's an organizational capacity and funding problem to ramp up to the scale of the problem. That's probably the biggest one. And then I think we need incentives for private lands owners to contribute and be part of the solution. Because it doesn't do any good to manage forest on one side of the line when you have non-fire resilient private land on the other.
All right, thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I yield back my remaining time.
Thank you, Mr. Balderson.
Thank you.
Appreciate that. At this point, I will yield myself 5 minutes, not just because it's my prerogative as chair, but I guess I'm in order, so I will do that. Chief, good afternoon, and thank you for being here. I appreciate you, not only your expertise, but I appreciate you being able to talk about such a relevant and topical topic, especially concerning this type of issue with the 2020 wildfire year response and recovery efforts, especially with someone like me who comes from the Central Coast of California and actually had to be evacuated within the last couple months because of the Carmel fire that was coming up over the hill about a half mile from my house, in which I saw the flames. But that being said, I was one of the fortunate ones, one of the fortunate many, thanks to the good work of CAL FIRE and our firemen and first responders who did a good job battling that blaze, and we were able to return to our home. So obviously, this is something that literally is not just relevant, it's something that's important to all of us, obviously in California, and I echo what Congressman Costa was saying in regards to how we have to address this. But with you, I want to hit on 4 areas in my questioning, just to let you know, kind of lay it out for you: forest management, reforestation, Forest Service staffing, and prescribed burns. So the first thing is I want to start with forest management projects and wildfire risk reduction. In your testimony, you highlighted the importance of proactively conducting forest management projects to create healthy fire-resilient conditions on our forest lands. Can you provide your vision of what I just said, proactive forest management? And does it include wildfire risk reduction projects? And if so, how should we best implement those types of projects?
Thank you. Great question. My vision of this is that we have these large landscapes that we have to plan across the entire landscape, all lands. And yes, a lot of the work has to be done on national forest, and we have to strategically treat these landscapes. If they're too dense, we'll have to thin them out, but ultimately we have to do prescribed fire. That's really the only thing that's going to get a large landscape, particularly in California, back into a fire-resilient condition. And it takes a lot of cooperation and imagination, by the way, to make that happen, and particularly in a state like California with so much population.
Yeah, understood, and I appreciate that. And obviously, I believe, as you heard Congressman LaMalfa talk about, that one of these first steps, at least how we can help out, is through the Wildfire and Public Safety Act. And then obviously, I know I'm running short on time. I want to talk, just kind of remind you about the Replant Act when it comes to forest restoration. But then I also want to hit on another topic that's important, near and dear to my district in the Los Padres National Forest, Forest Service staffing. I've spoke with Chief Christensen, I've spoke with Undersecretary Hubbard about the shortages that are not just affecting, but really plaguing our national forests. And so I want to basically talk to you, let you know that I understand the 2020 fire funding fix will kick in soon, but I've also gotten mixed reviews on whether this funding fix will actually help address the shortages of staffing. In your opinion, Chief, will the fire fix, what will it do in terms of filling those vacancies of non-fire positions, and what can we do in Congress to help you?
Well, it does provide the opportunity, we think, because it's putting some of the fire suppression off the books, if you will. There's an amount of money, if it were to be reinvested into staffing, it could make an incredible difference, because on average, everything other than fire is about 60% less than what it used to be.
Understood, understood. And just going back actually to forest restoration, when it comes to reforestation, would lifting the spending cap on the Reforestation Trust Fund help address the issue of reforestation post-disaster?
I think there's a number of other constraints, but that the Forest Service could use that, I'm sure.
Okay, great. Now, in regards to prescribed burns, I know we've had a pretty good discussion on this during the time you've been here. Can you talk to me about Forest Service plans to better utilize prescribed burns in the state moving forward as compared to the past 50 years? And would a prescribed fire center that trains individuals in prescribed fire methods, would that help as well?
I believe it would. I would say that in the southeast, that's quite a fire culture there, both on private and federal lands, and they're burning through their acreages in quite a frequent basis, and there's a lot of skill. We need to develop that out west as well.
Understood. Thank you. My time is up. I appreciate your answers. Thank you very much, Chief. I now yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from South Dakota, Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate it. Of course, there's been a lot of attention, and rightfully so, given to all of the wildfires. I mean, the images are just tragic. The numbers, the data is just tragic. We don't see as much news coverage, it seems to me, on how proactive fuels management can really reduce that risk. There are not anywhere near as many projects on Forest Service land as I'd like to see that make it all the way through to implementation. And so sometimes those mitigation stories are fewer and further between than we'd like. To that end, I want to highlight for my colleagues some of the examples from South Dakota where this proactive forest management really worked. I mean, we really can break the fire triangle by managing fuel loads, and we can protect lives and property, and of course the critical habitat, not just for creatures, but for obviously humans who use that area for all manner of recreation. And so one example is just 3 weeks ago, and it was a hot, dry, windy day, and the Bear Fire started on the Black Hills National Forest. This was southwest of Deerfield Lake. And that's a highly popular recreation area. The fire was started by a lightning strike, which obviously is not that uncommon. And even though the weather conditions were critical, this fire only burned for 5 acres. It could have been so much worse. So why was it only 5 acres? And a large part of that is because the fire burned in an area that had recently been thinned because of timber sales. And frankly, another timber sale was active nearby. And that harvest, it reduced the fuels and it improved the roads, the access crisscrossing the area. And that made for a quick response, obviously, for our firefighters. And having that fuel out of there meant that what didn't burn anywhere near as hot. And of course, Chief, I'm not telling you anything you don't know. You're the professional. But I do want to highlight some of these successes. And that is certainly not the only example. It's the most recent. But I brought some pictures from 2015 where we had a very similar situation happen. The North Pole fire started. And so, here we can see this has been actively managed. There had just been a timber sale here. And so you see a relative thinning of the trees. The burn area was far more modest than you would expect. And again, because we had these access roads that had been improved for the timber sales, the men and women whose job it is to go out and fight these fires were able to get there so much more quickly and were able to put this fire out so much more effectively than they otherwise would have. And so that framework, that preface, sir, really creates the jumping off point for my questions. And I would, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to enter in, or Madam Chairman, enter into the record these photos, smaller versions, as well as an article from 2015 in the Rapid City Journal that I think lays out this story well. And if there's no objection, I'd like to have that entered into the record, Madam Chair.
Without objection. So
Very good,
ordered.
thank you. So, Deputy Chief, the 2014 Farm Bill, and in response from individual states, the Forest Service designated 46.7 million acres as eligible to use the expedited NEPA authorities. And then in the 2018 Farm Bill, we made some tweaks to that. What's the status of those 46.7 million acres? This was all about, I think, treatment for infection, for bugs. I mean, to what extent has that treatment worked or is ongoing?
Yeah, thank you for your question, and I think your model that you laid out, it works. Thinning and doing prescribed fire really makes a difference, particularly if it's at an adequate scale. And thank you for those authorities that allowed us to increase our pace and scale. And I don't have the exact figures about what that, but I know that we've been actively treating fuels and harvesting timber to reduce density so we can do prescribed fire.
And I understand you don't have the exact number, but if you could follow up with my office, sir, I'd be interested to know the status of the 46.7 million acres. Because if for whatever reason the Forest Service hasn't been able to attack that full flexibility granted by the 14 and 18 farm bills, then we'd like to know if there's something more we can do to help you all do your job better.
Okay, Be happy to do that.
And then, given my short time, I won't ask another question, but I'll just note that I also have an interest in making sure that we continue to have a vibrant forest products industry. I think a managed forest is a healthy forest. That has absolutely been the case in South Dakota, although we are falling short with our targets for the number of 100 cubic feet that have been harvested. And so I'll be following up with your office or your agency so we can talk about the size of that gap and the most appropriate way to deal with it. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank
thanks
you.
for your indulgence, Madam Chair.
The chair now recognizes Congresswoman Schreier for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Forgotten how to do this. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, for allowing me to participate in this subcommittee hearing today. And thank you, Deputy Chief Phipps, for being here and taking our questions. Right at the beginning, when our chairwoman spoke, she said that this was terrifying, and I would wholeheartedly agree. Coming from Washington State, many parts of my district were on fire. In my own home, we were essentially locked in the house for a week with hazardous air quality with AQIs over 300 for over a week. And I think one of the scariest and most terrifying parts is that this may be our new normal. And I think it should lend real urgency and seriousness to how we address climate change, how we manage our forests and forest resiliency, but also about being thoughtful about where we build with respect to the WUI. I wanted to bring up one issue before I ask a question. One of the areas in my district that was on fire was the Evans Canyon fire. It was big enough that it spanned 2 big counties. Most of it was in the neighboring county, but much of it was in the one in my district. Our full force of firefighters contributed to the effort to put it out. But because of some rules about FMAG grants, only one of the counties got assistance, and the one in my district didn't. And so we are working with FEMA to get that assistance, but I may at some point need to call on you to see if perhaps we could lend your weight to that discussion. My question, and we've spoken before about COVID, I'll get to that in a moment if I have time, but I wanted to talk about what happens after a fire. The landslides, the erosion, the lack of habitat. And I know that there's something called the Burned Area Emergency Response Teams, the BEAR teams. And I wanted to talk about the fact that just like the Evans Creek fire Canyon fire spanned different areas, it's not just confined to national forest. The same thing happens really everywhere in the state of Washington. National forests, state forests, community forests, and they all essentially feed to the same place. And I was just wondering how the BEAR teams coordinate the national or the federal and some of those more local efforts, because when there's a landslide, it brushes through all of it. It affects all of the surrounding water areas. Can you help me understand that?
Yeah, BEAR teams are quite resourceful. A lot of them are out there even sometimes before the fire is totally out, working to do assessments. They do coordinate with local interest and other governments and within USDA, the NRCS, for example, to try to bring to bear everything that's needed to prevent further tragedy once rains come, basically. Right. And try to do seeding, scarification, reestablishing drainage, and they're quite effective at it, and we do have funding to do that. It's going to be a challenge because doing that over 7 million acres this year will require prioritization to make sure we go after the most potentially impactful areas first.
And do you do that also in community forests and state lands, or do you just confine those efforts to federal lands?
Well, the BEAR teams would coordinate if there's probably not any large, well, let me put it this way, all these large fires include private lands. If they happen to be state lands, they'd coordinate with them as well to make sure that collectively they get the best outcome.
Great. One more question. We spoke back in July about COVID plans. You had phenomenal plans, keeping fires small, keeping firefighters in cohorts, doing whatever you could to prevent the spread within a cohort, but also to prevent mingling. And then all those best laid plans I don't know, I won't say went up in smoke, but it became very challenging when all of a sudden now we have all these forest fires raging at the same time. They're all too big, mingling of groups, even people coming in from out of state or out of country. How are you doing with testing and people converting to coronavirus positive? How are you handling the pandemic?
We've actually done a lot. Thank you for that question. We've, before the fire season really got going, we did an assessment on a state-by-state basis about testing. We had a number of teams developing our protocols. We decided that if somebody tested positive, we would pay for the test. If it wasn't free, that we would pay for lodging, for quarantine, trying to manage the incentive system of that, the social distancing, the fire camps spread out. And, I was quite concerned, particularly after this big fire siege that we've had, but we're not seeing the rate of infections. In fact, we're not yet. I think people they've been modularizing, trying to stay away, and it's been quite remarkable. I think the fire community did a really nice job this year.
It's great. Thank you, and congratulations. It's great news. Thank you.
Thank you.
Again, Deputy Chief Phipps, thank you for being here today. Thank you for your testimony. How we come together to help our Western states respond to, recover from, and rebuild stronger can be a defining act in these times. In addition to our important conversation today, there's so much more work to be done beyond the jurisdiction of this subcommittee, including support for community and home rebuilding, for rural development, for healthcare services, for emergency management and response needs in areas devastated by wildfires, and taking meaningful actions to further reduce our carbon footprint across all sectors of the economy and work to build a more resilient and sustainable economy. There is so much more work that needs to be done by this subcommittee and this committee on both questions of what are the solutions we can look for within the agricultural and forestry sectors. I stand ready to continue this work, and as I said at the top of this hearing, we should not have to wait for the ash of the wildfires to reach the Capitol steps to take action. I look forward to our continued work together as a subcommittee, Congress, and a nation as we support these efforts. I'd like to thank the USDA staff and our witness today for being here. Thank you for being patient with our technological challenges, and thank you for being patient during our vote timeframe. The chair now recognizes the ranking member for a closing statement.
Thank you again, Madam Chair. It's too bad on the competing votes and committees and such today, but I think we've covered a lot of good ground in our time here. With your permission too, I'd like to submit another letter as well from the Federal Forest Resource Coalition that is, thank you, that is speaking about a lot of the issues with critical habitat designations and the hands-off approach to management that has actually failed us for so long. So I'll submit that, and thank you again, Mr. Phipps, for your attention to these important issues, because our fires are still burning, and it's going to take an incredible amount of effort. As you mentioned, we have a 110-year problem that we can hope we can catch up in only 10 or less, but it will require going at what is known as a pace and scale much higher than what we have seen in the past. We need to be able to work through restrictions that are caused by NEPA. NEPA is well intended, but and a lot of times we're plowing the same old ground on that. We don't need a NEPA document for doing the types of practices we already know are good practices. We can do this on a one-pager instead of 18 months or more of study and lawsuits and all that. I talk about, remember right, it's the ranch fire from a couple years ago over on the west side of the northern part of California, 400,000 acres. And after 2 years of wrangling, they wanted to put in a process to do some accelerated work along roadways and other key areas. 7,000 acres, 7,000 out of 400,000 that had been burned, of salvage, of revitalization along roadways as a strategic area to recover and make more fireproof, make more hardened from fire. So what happens on that? A lawsuit, and the court throws out all that work, and we have yet more delay. We can't keep having these sorts of things happening. So help us help you with U.S. Forest Service. Bring to us, please, legislative ideas to help with the roadblocks that you face for so many that in the service that would like to get these projects done at a pace and scale that's going to be realistically helpful in the short term so we have a better long term. My constituents are very, very tired of it. They're tired of the roadblocks to the work. They're tired of the hurdles to getting contracts to be part of a solution there for equipment. They're tired of constantly being in danger, and the air quality problems are right there in their backyard, 10 times on the scale of what would be deemed unhealthy in some cases. So we're all feeling it, and when we see our urban friends even feeling it, not only in the Bay Area, but all of California, and even here on the East Coast, then I hope it really sounds the alarm that we've got to do something. It's got to be a lot more dramatic. And some of it might, on its surface, be unpopular. When we're talking about prescribed burning, on one of those burn days, it's not going to be popular. But we need to be able to educate people and say, you know, this is necessary, because when we don't do it, we have a scale of fire that is multiple times worse for air quality and, of course, for habitat, for wildlife, the forest asset on public lands that belongs to all of us. And so we'll have to be bold and step over a line and say, no, we must do this, because as we've talked about, 110 years of putting the fire out without doing the other half of the equation that nature used to do. Now, when nature did it, you know, you can go back in a long ways in history and find nature used to burn millions of acres at a time, and it would go all year until whenever the next rainy season would be. And that's nature's way, and we respect that. But if we have the hybrid of mankind helping out, using nature's tools, using what the Native Americans used to use, we can have a winning equation here. And that's what we really need. That's what the public demands. That's what they cry out for when in the letter that Mr. Daley and others, many others, wrote or could write to us. So thank you again for your appearance and for taking this back to the service there. And again, Chair Spanfelder, I really, really appreciate you putting this together for us today and having this opportunity before Congress might adjourn for the year. We'll see. But thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ranking Member LaMalfa, and thank you for always advocating for this subcommittee's strong work in the area of forestry. And my heart is with your constituents, as I know they continue to face challenges. Under the rules of the committee, the record of today's hearing will remain open for 10 calendar days to receive additional material and supplementary written responses from witnesses to any question posed by a member. This hearing of the Subcommittee on Conservation and Forestry is adjourned.